Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we hear about the growing and local threat from espionage.
There is always that risk, the risk of espionage, the risk of spies. This is one of the things that could unravel our operational advantage, which we've worked so hard for 100 plus years to establish. If there was a conflict, I am convinced that these people that have sold their souls to share things like Western TTPs, it will cost lives. It will cost our folks lives.
Also in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Where I am now, I suppose, Sergeant, but again, passing my phase 2 training at Catterick was pretty proud of because that was nails.
Find out who is under the hat at the end of this episode. Now, protecting the RAF's secrets is a lifelong responsibility of everyone who wears the uniform, whether that's online, on a night out, or even in your own neighbourhood. In this frank discussion with Air and Space Commander Air Marshal Harvey Smith, he told me the threat could be closer than you think. Air Marshal Harvey Smith, Air and Space Commander. It's great to have you back on Inside Air.
Nice to see you. Thanks very much for coming for a re-attack.
Well, under a different hat now, isn't it?
Yes, a new title, slightly changed role. It's not just a name change. In fact, that was the very last thing we did on the HQ up model work that we've been doing here down at Air Command. Specifically just around tightening up how this place works, basically. And I think we're making good progress on that. But part of that was recognising that the 2 3-star jobs were maybe not necessarily named correctly, because we did much more than where I was before, DCOM Ops, Deputy Commander Ops. People would say, so who's the Commander Ops? And I'd say, well, that's me. I'm Deputy Commander of the Air Force. Oh, yeah, it's all a bit confusing. So, yes.
Confusion. So you're Air and Space Commander. I mean, should we read into this? Does this mean that one day we'll be the Royal Air and Space Force?
That's a great question. And particularly in my last job, when I was Director Space in MOD, and we were doing all of the analysis that underpinned should we or shouldn't we have a UK Space Command, we did investigate that. You know, the rite of arc was, one day will we have a Royal Space Force? And we shouldn't be naive enough to think that the answer is no. We should think maybe 50, 100 years from now, maybe there will be a Royal Space Force. 200 years ago, if you'd asked someone, will there be a Royal Air Force, they would have laughed at you. So, we shouldn't undermine any of those future decisions for our children's children to make. So the work that we did around Space Command and how that's structured was done specifically so that if one day it were to be pulled out of where it currently sits under the umbrella of the Royal Air Force and be asked to stand up as its own entity, Royal Space Force or something like that, that it could, and it wouldn't rip the heart out of the Air Force in doing that. So
all I can imagine is that there'll be arguments over where does air finish and space start. Right,
exactly. Well, there you go. Some would say at the Kármán line. Where's the Kármán line? Even that's up for debate. But anyway, yes.
Now, we're here today to talk about a serious subject, and I think what we should do is just ask you to start by laying down the picture of what is the global threat picture today.
Yes. So firstly, I just want to say thank you to you for allowing me to use Inside Air for having this conversation. I've only done one of these before, as you know, and what really struck me was how many people have kind of, stop me in the street, as it were, to say, "Oh, I heard you on Inside Air," and it gets such a broad audience from younger cadets right up to my peers across defence. So A, that's brilliant, well done on Inside Air. But B, it's such a brilliant vehicle to have meaningfully challenging discussions. And one of those is around security and how we see the threat picture at the moment. And the threat picture, many folk will have heard me talk about this. I've been in this job just over a year now. And actually what's become really, really apparent to me is how the threat picture of the world is changing and has changed. And it's not just what's on our doorstep in Ukraine. I was doing a speech the other day about Ukraine and the horrific things that are happening there. And someone afterwards said to me, "Well, do we really need to worry about that? It's this whole other place." And I said to them, it's closer to get to fly to Kyiv than it is to fly to Tenerife. And when you think about where you went on your summer holidays this year, that gives you an idea of how close these threats are to us as in nature. And that's just physically. In the cyber world and the space world, that those things are omnipresent. So that threat's here. And it really has quite dramatically changed, certainly from where I would have been 10 years ago, where all we were really talking about was the violent extremist threats, some of the horrific stuff we saw happen there post 9/11, etc. And that was our big focus, and less about things that would have been state-on-state type discussion of threat, like spies and espionage and all that stuff that people think they just read in a novel or watch on a Netflix drama. And actually those things are really very real. And they have been. They always have been. They didn't go away at the end of the Cold War. That whole network of espionage stayed. And actually in a world of competition where we're competing with potential adversaries, not just in the military sense, but on things like intellectual property. This nation is known for wringing every bit of goodness out of whatever equipment we have. We'll get a piece of kit and we buy it or we procure it for a certain thing, and then we end up using it for 1,000 other things. The Tornado's such a brilliant example of that, like the Swiss Army knife of fast jets.
I'm surprised you didn't say Harrier.
Yeah, well, the Harrier was too, but we achieved even more with Tornado. It went from low-level nuclear strike airplane to what it ultimately ended up doing in places like Afghanistan. It was amazing what our Air Force and our industries were able to do with that one platform. And, other nations are more than happy to just steal the ideas directly from us rather than do the hard graft and the hard thinking to have that type of an approach themselves.
We're not just talking about Europe, though, are we?
Absolutely not. No, this is a global threat, and we see it more and more, particularly from the Pacific, from China. And we know very publicly that the cyber threat in particular from that part of the world is huge. We just have to look at how many people that nation employs in doing hacking and cyber espionage. It's unbelievable. For every one of us, there's hundreds of them doing this and constantly trying to steal intellectual property from us. So that the threat, the espionage threat, from my perspective, has never been bigger. It's never been more apparent. And I think there's a discussion to be had with our folk, because what's changed in my time in the service, I joined just at the end of the Cold War. That's just how old I am. But all that thinking was still there. When you would go out for the night, there would always be someone on shark watch. This idea of loose lips sink ships. You wouldn't necessarily talk about the 4 ship you'd flown that day. You wouldn't be down the pub necessarily talking about it in the open. Whereas it's not like that now. We've got, everybody carries an iPhone or an equivalent. They're posting stuff all the time. Everyone's their own journalist. Because they're proud of what they do, they're excited by what they do, and that's brilliant, and we should encourage that. But it's this discussion around being mindful about who else is looking at that, and what are you leaving yourself open to, and what actually are you giving away? What are you sharing that you shouldn't be? And it's not just top secret and the likes. Obviously, that's very highly protected. But it's this aggregation of small things.
It's building of the puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to help us out, what does a spy look like?
Well, it could look like you or me.
Okay.
Can look like anybody. That's the point. And I would wager, not that I'm an expert on spies, but I would wager that the very best one is the one that's most innocuous. It's the lady pushing the pram with the crying baby, who you think's having a real struggle that morning, but is actually sat next to you in the coffee shop listening to and recording everything you say. It was interesting last year, there was the big annual kind of Air Chiefs Conference equivalent in DC. It's called the AFA. And it was held in a big, it's the big national conference centre just outside of DC at National Harbour. And someone had taken a picture of the foyer, the kind of cafeteria, open cafeteria area where people were in between presentations, were grabbing coffee and catching up with friends and talking about the world and what's going on, what they'd just heard in the presentation. And some chap had taken a picture of two very senior officers stood with a coffee each having a chat, and over their right hand shoulder a man sitting kind of on his phone just nonchalantly passing his day actually ends up being a spy. So I'll not say from what nation, but they were very quickly able to say that chap is here for a reason and it's not to drink coffee. And it's just making our people aware that they need to be mindful of that stuff.
So if our potential adversaries are Russia and China that you've mentioned, should we expect to listen out for Chinese accents?
Well, no, absolutely not. And in fact, again, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, you want to blend in, you want to just fit in and be the grey man. That's the whole point. A really, really good spy is someone that you don't notice. It's someone that when people say, "Did you see that person?" you go, "I did see someone, and I can't really remember what they looked like, or they didn't stand out. They were the grey man, as it were." That's the expert. The person that's standing out is not very good at their job.
We're going to talk about the National Security Act today, because that is something very new. I'd like you to tell us why that, from your opinion, given that you're not a government spokesperson per se.
Yes.
But what is the difference between the NSA and the Official Secrets Act? Why do we need the National Security Act?
I think in the simplest of terms, we all know the Official Secrets Act, which in complete layman's terms is when you're in the military and you get told stuff, don't tell it to all the folk. Be sensible about what you share. And we all, at the very basic level, know that there's an Official Secrets Act that we sign the first day we kind of sign up to being in the military, and other departments, of course. But it's very old. It's been around for a long time. Some of the language there is quite woolly. It's quite broad, which perhaps means that if you're trying to use it to pin something down quite specifically, becomes quite difficult. So the new National Security Bill has tightened that all up, and it's given us a little bit more of an ability to prosecute, to be much clearer in terms of what's right and what's wrong, less woolly, and much more specific around if you did these things, then here's how the state, here's how government would react to that in terms of a legal position, and effectively gives us a bit more of a stick. At the moment, that's been a bit lacking, and some of the areas that we've recently in the past tried to use Official Secrets Act hold people to account. We found that they've maybe been able to wriggle out of some of the loopholes that are there, basically because it was written for a different time. The ethos of it is 100,000,000% correct. Don't share our stuff with bad people. It's simple as that. But in pure legalese, it's been difficult to use that and to enforce it.
Is that because of the burden of proof?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer or an expert on that side of it, but in my tiny Northern Irish brain, how I see this is the new National Security Bill now is much tauter. It's much cleaner in terms of laying things out of what you can and can't do. And importantly, if you are willingly going beyond that, it gives the authorities the ability to prosecute you in a more meaningful way, all the way up to what could be a life imprisonment. And I know we've always had that discussion around Official Secrets Act, but it's was proving incredibly difficult to enact that, and the National Security Bill tightens that up.
So it's looking for things that people might do without necessarily having to identify the consequences of whatever it is they've done.
Absolutely, yes. So, for example, to give you a relevant contemporary example, which is a topic I did want to branch into today, and is a super serious topic, which some, again, across the Air Force may have heard me talk about. Up until relatively recently, this whole topic that I'm about to raise here was kept quite close hold. But in recent months, we've had the ability to speak about it publicly because that's part of the deterrent posture. And it's not that often that things come across my desk that make me angry or cross, but this definitely has. So it's really very serious and troubling, to be honest. So what we're seeing are certain companies which are poaching people either directly out of the Air Force or more recently looking for folk that have just left or are just about to leave the Air Force. Having a look at what their expertise is. And a lot of our folk, and again, this kind of links back to our earlier conversation, a lot of our folk lay that out there for the world to see. It's not hard to work that out if you're on LinkedIn or you're on some other equivalents to that, and you've put your whole CV on there. So these companies are, it's quite easy for them to go and say, oh, right, you used to be, until quite recently, a pilot flying Hercules. Well, that's a person we might be interested in recruiting into our team. And what we're finding are nations like China are using third-party companies to recruit folk like that, and then to bring them into China to use them to train the Chinese Air Force, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, the PLAF, to become better, to become as good as us. So for large sums of money, to the tune of £250,000 a year, people are being enticed away to go and train what could become a potential adversary in the future, to be as good as us. So that erodes our operational advantage over those types of potential adversaries, and actually erodes our deterrent effect, because the deterrent that we have is that we're better than you, so don't start a fight.
Now, you are a former Harrier pilot, and can you explain what TTPs are and how important they are to you as a fast jet pilot?
Yeah. So TTPs are simply the way we do things.
What does it stand for?
TTP, the acronym, tactics, techniques, and procedures. But basically, how we do our business, how we do things, the way we would organise ourselves to fight in a certain way, the way we would fly a 4-ship to go against a certain threat. the way we might use certain platforms to enhance the capability that it can deliver. So TTPs are the intellectual edge of bringing a piece of equipment to life.
So consequentially, if you were in an air fight with an adversarial fighter, how would you feel if your opponent knew your TTPs?
Right. So they know your secret sauce. That's what they know, which is your edge. So you've given that away. If you give away your TTPs, you're giving away your secret sauce. So people can work quite hard, again, linking back to a previous conversation around stealing intellectual property. So a certain nation with very good cyber hackers might be able to break into the servers of industry, defense industry, and we've seen this happen with various companies. They can steal the blueprints and the design and, how an airplane, how fast it'll go, how high it'll go, how much G it'll pull, the specifics, the metrics of it. But what they don't have is then how you're going to use it. That's the TTPs, that's your secret sauce, that's your intellectual edge, that's what the Royal Air Force is really, really very good at, and we always have been. So if you're giving that away, and then you think on the day of the fight, the person that you're about to fight knows all of that, then it's a zero-sum game. I guess it's a bit like going into a boxing match and your opponent being told, for the first 3 rounds, here's how the other guy's going to fight. They'll always lead with the left and then go right. And, so all of that, so you can counter it. And it puts us at a strategic disadvantage, a distinct disadvantage, because that's now been given away. And of course, on the day of the races, when you are fighting, a good enemy will quickly learn your TTPs, because over the first few weeks of fighting, even through the fog and friction of that, a good enemy will learn and adapt. And we're seeing this happen in Ukraine at the moment. Almost a cat and mouse, a tit for tat, Ukraine, Russia, as they go back and forth using things like small one-way attack drones. They'll be used in a certain way. Maybe Russia will use them. They'll have some positive effect. Ukraine will work out how to jam those ones. Russia will adapt it. So you just constantly have this cat and mouse. But that's when you're in the fight. That's normal business. That's to be expected. You don't want that all to be given away prior to going fighting. Again, giving up your secret sauce and giving up the TTPs.
That's the problem that has been identified, is that there are companies. I mean, it's been in the media.
Yeah.
The Test Flight Academy of South Africa,
yes.
Not at all connected to the South African government.
No.
It's a commercial enterprise. What can you tell us about this? I mean, last year, I think it's October last year, there was some
so we
news
did
on this.
That. I mean, that company is of particular interest and of a particular concern. We know they've been recruiting not just Air Force folk, but others, Royal Navy folk too, not just British, but other nations, Western forces, let's say, not just pilots, but other professions as well, because obviously our capability is much broader than just the people that sit in the cockpits. Not that the pilots may think otherwise, but we all know, I jest, but we all know that there's a broader piece to the capability here, and our people that's our fundamental intellectual edge, is the breadth of the people we have. So they've been very smart at going after a broad kind of portfolio there. And effectively throwing large sums of money at these folk to entice them to go to Beijing to teach the Chinese Air Force how to be as good, if not better than us. And we have observed that training that they're providing is having an effect on how the Chinese Air Force does its business. And over the last few years, they have dramatically changed how they do that. To look more Western, to be more Western, and it's because of those types of activities, those training activities being provided by companies like Tafasa. So quite a few months ago, government publicly outed the company. We thought that would be the end of it. It has not been. And actually, since then, there have been examples of the company continuing to try to poach our people away. We as a service, we the Air Force, we Defence, and broader across Whitehall, are doing everything we can to get the message out to our people to be wary of this. Hence this podcast today and us having this discussion is part of that. And doing everything we can to explain to our people a few things. The first is, plain and simple, it's not right to do it. It wouldn't be often I would use words like treachery and treason, but that's what I think this is. I think people that take large sums of money to go and share things like TTPs and more with a nation that could become a potential adversary to us, and some of that rhetoric we see play out on the public scene. That feels like treachery and treason to me. That feels like not the types of qualities in a person that I would want to be in the RAF. That feels like you're letting down your previous colleagues, your friends, families, the nation. Where does it stop? So hence my comment earlier about this making me feel quite angry, because it should do, and it should make our people feel angry as well, because ultimately, and I am convinced that should there end up being some semblance of conflict, God forbid there is, and hopefully we continue to work through in a way that we don't end up in a conflict. But if there was a conflict, I am convinced that these people that have sold their souls to share things like Western TTPs, it will cost lives. It will cost our folks lives, because they don't have that intellectual advantage on day one of the fight. When they enter the fight, their adversary will know what their TTP is going to be, and it'll be a fairer fight rather than a fight that we know we can win right off the bat. So I think there's that point as a start. And secondly, again, linking to the discussion around the National Security Bill, now that that has achieved royal assent and we're moving forward with that in a more meaningful way as a tool to deter and ultimately as a tool to punish, within the text of the National Security Bill, it specifically references people that would do those types of activities, and in particular, the sharing of TTPs. So those folk that are doing it now with the National Security Bill over the line could be liable to prosecution, and there's work going on across Whitehall to that endeavour. We're having a lot of discussion, not just within the UK and within our own department, MOD, but also with our very close allies across NATO. I've had quite a few discussions into NATO and with the US to try to make our folk aware that this threat is there, that, if someone approaches you in the pub and tells you that you're the funniest and most handsome person they've ever met, and would you like £250,000 to come and teach someone how to do something that's unclassified, that should feel a bit weird to you. If that doesn't normally happen on a Friday night, that should probably ring alarm bells and you need to pick the phone up. And I think that's the last point. It's about, since I've been involved with this, what's been really interesting to me is just how many folk have come up to me and said, I know someone that was approached on this, or, on my whatever WhatsApp group, we've been talking about this and there's a whole list of names put up. And we're asking people, if you've been approached, please let us know. If you know someone else who's been approached, or worse, if you know someone who's doing it, please let us know. If you're aware of anything about it and you think that just doesn't feel right, just let us know. We're just trying to get our arms around it to close it down.
So just for clarification, prior to the National Security Act aircraft receiving royal assent, which I think was in July, wasn't it?
Yeah, 11th of July.
Then prior to that moment, there was a warning. It wasn't necessarily illegal, but does it mean that that will be an illegal act to go and operate?
Yes.
Okay.
Simple as that.
And the consequences?
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, but
they're not light.
The positive step forward is that it's black and white now that you're going to be breaking the law. I think as these things go forward, like all cases of this nature, the evidence that would underpin your particular case would determine then what consequences there were. It has been very clear in the National Security Bill that the right of ARC is life imprisonment. So this is not a light thing. This is not a slap on the wrist, come in for a stern talking to. This is you could end up in jail. But each of those cases will be investigated on their own merit.
Well, Air Marshal Smith, this is a very serious subject that we've talked about today.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And like I said earlier, it's just, I didn't necessarily... I think we'd be using an Inside Air podcast to talk about this stuff, but it is incredibly important. If we don't get this right and we don't rally round as a service and as a community, then this is one of the things that could unravel our operational advantage, which we've worked so hard for 100+ years to establish. So it's so important, and there is a role for every single person in the enterprise. This isn't just about those folk that sit in a uniform. It's anyone who's part of the enterprise. If you're aware of any of this activity, then please just reach out. And then we'll take it forward from there. The key, I am determined, many others are determined that we get our arms around this and we get it put to bed as quickly as we can. That said, there is always that risk, the risk of espionage, the risk of spies. What's that mean to us? The person that's listening to your conversation in the pub or the coffee shop, the person that's following you on Twitter or is... sneaking into your Instagram profile or whatever. That risk will always exist. So what I'm really hoping is that this discussion generates further discussion amongst our people, and it just raises the bar a little bit. Just that little bit of skepticism around, my point of, if you're the most handsome, in the bar, then that doesn't normally happen to you. Then that's probably a red flag, and you want to think about taking a step back and looking out for each other on that. The Shark Watch thing, the loose lip sink ships. It kind of feels to me that since the Cold War, it didn't go away. It kind of became almost a cool thing. People have the loose lips sink ships poster in the kitchen type thing. We need those posters back in work. We need people to be very mindful of this, that when they're walking out of work at the end of the day, they leave that stuff behind, because here we know we can protect it. We can't necessarily when you're in cyber world and digital world, or when you're down the pub or in the coffee shop. That's for the individual to do. That's their responsibility, and I just need people to be a little bit more aware of that.
Hey, Marshal Smith, thank you for coming back on Inside Air.
Thanks very much.
If you do have any information or concerns around this subject, then please report through the Air Principal Security Advisor's Office using the warning and reporting system. The email address for this is air-rafwarp@mod.gov.uk.
I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews with Reheat for Inside Air. Royal Air Force Typhoon fighter jets have successfully landed on and taken off from a regular road for the first time. 2 RAF frontline jets tested and proved the capability in Finland as part of Exercise Bana. The Finnish Air Force's annual training exercise took place on a single-lane road. which is usually used for normal road traffic, but specially designed as an emergency landing strip to sustain aircraft activity if required. Exercise Cobra Warrior 23-2 has seen more than 50 aircraft and 6 allied countries work together in an exercise coordinated by the Air and Space Warfare Centre. It took place across the UK and over air, sea, land, space and cyber domains. During the exercise, the RAF's F-35B Lightning took part from HMS Queen Elizabeth. An A400M Atlas delivered a 25-tonne multiple launch rocket system to a temporary landing zone to test its targeting. And gunners from 51 Squadron RAF Regiment were given air support from US Air Force Pave Hawk helicopters to secure a simulated crash site and rescue injured crew. RAF Fylingdales is the UK's primary military space sensor and has marked 60 years since the establishment of the station. Its primary duty is ballistic missile early warning, which ensures a surprise missile attack cannot succeed by providing data to the UK Space Operations Centre at RAF High Wycombe. Personnel at the station routinely conduct 10 to 12,000 tracks of objects in low Earth orbit every day, and the radar can detect objects the size of a drinks can up to 3,000 miles into space. And finally, athletes representing the RAF have returned from Germany after participating at the Invictus Games. Royal Air Force veteran and military personnel made up 19 of the 59 Team UK team, collecting 69 medals in all, including golds in the men's 100-metre freestyle swimming and women's shot put, as well as silver medals in mixed wheelchair rugby. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
Known as Jock, nickname.
What's your profession?
Regiment Gunner.
What's the best thing about your job?
Probably seeing the recruits graduate at the end of their course.
Hardest part of your job?
Problem recruits and recruits with bad attitude.
Best location you've served?
It's going to be a toss-up between Qatar and Kuwait.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
Don't actually go without, or I don't need a luxury, but probably wouldn't go without my sense of humour.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Where I am now, I suppose. Sergeant, but again, passing my phase 2 training at Catterick was pretty proud at, because that was nails. But yeah, probably Sergeant of Reserve training, I would say.
Thank you, Sergeant Jock Charity from RAF Halton, for helping us to graduate from another instalment of Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.